The morning of April 18, 1988, began like any other in the Persian Gulf. Soviet intelligence vessels, disguised as merchant ships, maintained their careful watch over American naval operations. These weren't ordinary cargo haulers. Below deck, teams of specially trained technicians monitored sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment, tracking every radio transmission, every radar pulse, every electronic whisper from the American fleet operating nearby. Before we dive deeper, if you enjoy stories like this, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. What they were about to witness would fundamentally alter Moscow's understanding of modern warfare. 4 days earlier, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, an American frigate, had struck an Iranian mine in international waters. 10 sailors were injured. The ship's keel cracked open, and only extraordinary damage control kept her from sinking. The Iranians had been playing a dangerous game for months, attacking neutral shipping, laying mines in international waters, and harassing vessels under the protection of American warships. The mining of the Samuel B. Roberts crossed a line. Now the Americans were planning their response, and Soviet intelligence wanted to watch. The Soviets had been observing American naval operations in the Gulf for years, but they'd never seen anything quite like the force assembling that April morning. 2 surface action groups, guided missile cruisers, destroyers, frigates, and somewhere beneath the waves, attacked submarines. The Iranian Navy wasn't small. They possessed modern warships purchased during the Shah's era, including American-made frigates, missile boats, patrol craft, and well-defended offshore oil platforms that doubled as military observation posts. On paper, this would be a conventional naval engagement, ships against ships, missiles against missiles, the kind of battle naval commanders had trained for since World War II. The Soviet observers settled in to watch what they assumed would be a straightforward, if violent, confrontation. At 0600 hours, American forces initiated their attack on 2 Iranian oil platforms, Sasan and Siri. These weren't just drilling operations. Intelligence had confirmed they served as staging bases for Iranian mine-laying boats and command posts for attacks on commercial shipping. The platforms had to be neutralized. The Soviet technicians expected to track the entire operation on their screens. American ships approaching, radar systems painting targets, fire control systems locking on, the electromagnetic signature of missile launches. Modern naval combat generates a distinctive electronic signature. Every radar, every radio, every targeting system leaves traces across the spectrum. But something was wrong. Their screens showed almost nothing. The Soviet equipment was sophisticated, among the best their military-industrial complex could produce. It could detect and classify radar emissions from hundreds of kilometers away, intercept radio communications, track the electronic signatures of weapon systems. Yet now, as a major naval battle unfolded just over the horizon, their displays showed only fragments, ghosts, shadows of signals that appeared and vanished before they could be properly analyzed. One of the senior technicians frantically adjusted his equipment, convinced something had malfunctioned, but the systems checked out. They were receiving signals, just not the signals that should be there. It was as if someone had thrown a blanket over the electromagnetic spectrum. Through binoculars, they could see the American ships maneuvering. They could hear the distant rumble of gunfire as Marines boarded the oil platforms. But electronically, the American fleet had somehow made itself partially invisible. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The Iranian defenders on the platforms radioed desperately for help. The Soviet listeners could intercept those transmissions clearly enough. Iranian voices calling for air support, for missile boats to sortie, for their naval forces to engage. The Iranian military was responding. The Siri oil platform was the first to fall. After the Marines cleared it, American demolition teams planted charges. The Soviets watched the structure erupt in flames, a pillar of black smoke rising into the clear Gulf sky. The Sasan platform followed soon after. Now Iranian naval forces were entering the battle. The frigate Sahand, one of their most capable warships, began moving to engage the Americans. Missile boats raced from their bases. This was the moment the Soviets had been waiting for. A genuine naval engagement between modern forces. The Sahand was a serious threat. The former American Vosper Mark V class frigate carried surface-to-surface missiles, radar-guided guns, and a trained crew. As she closed with American forces, her fire control radars should have lit up Soviet displays like a Christmas tree. The distinctive frequency patterns of an American-designed weapons system, now in Iranian hands, should have been unmistakable. But the Soviet screens remained eerily quiet. Then their equipment registered something strange. A sudden, brief spike in radar activity from the American ships, like someone opening a door just long enough to look outside before slamming it shut again. Seconds later, the Iranians transmitted a frantic distress call. The Sahand had been hit. The Soviet technicians scrambled to understand what had happened. They detected no missile launch signatures, no sustained radar locks, no prolonged fire control sequences. Yet somehow, American missiles had found their target with devastating accuracy. The pattern repeated. Brief electromagnetic bursts from American ships, so short and controlled, they barely registered. Then Iranian vessels erupting in flames or going silent. The missile boat Joshin approached American ships and actually managed to fire a Harpoon missile at the cruiser USS Wainwright. The Soviets tracked that launch clearly. They also tracked the Wainwright's response, a wall of chaff and electronic countermeasures that caused the Iranian missile to lose its target and splash harmlessly into the Gulf. Seconds later, the Joshin ceased to exist. American return fire, guided by systems the Soviets could barely detect, had reduced her to burning wreckage. Throughout the battle, the Soviet observers kept trying to piece together what was happening. Their training told them that modern naval combat required sustained radar emissions. You had to search for targets, track them, lock onto them with fire control systems, guide your missiles. Each step generated distinctive electronic signatures that could be detected, analyzed, and potentially countered. But the Americans weren't following those rules. They would go almost completely silent, electronically speaking. Then, for just a few seconds, targeting systems would activate with surgical precision. Missiles would launch. And before Iranian forces could react, before their own systems could lock onto the American ships, the electronic curtain would drop again. It was like fighting an opponent who could see perfectly in the dark while you were blind. The Sahand, still afloat but badly damaged, tried to limp back to port. The Americans weren't finished with her. Aircraft joined the battle, but again, the Soviet observers noted something disturbing. The attack aircraft approached their targets with minimal electronic emissions until the final moments before weapons release. The coordination between ships and aircraft was flawless, yet the communications that should have enabled such coordination were either encrypted beyond Soviet ability to decode or transmitted in burst transmissions too brief to track effectively. The Sahand sank that afternoon, torn apart by missiles and bombs. Another frigate, the Sabalan, fared little better. American aircraft caught her at sea and damaged her so severely she had to be towed back to port. Iranian gunboats and patrol craft scattered, many damaged or destroyed. By the time the sun set, half of Iran's operational naval force had been eliminated. American casualties? Not a single ship damaged. Not one aircraft lost. A few minor injuries among the boarding parties. Nothing more. The Soviet intelligence officers compiled their reports with growing unease. The tactical details were damning enough. A modern navy effectively destroyed in 8 hours. But the strategic implications were what truly terrified them. The Americans had demonstrated a level of electronic warfare capability that Soviet doctrine insisted shouldn't exist. The ability to coordinate complex multi-platform operations across hundreds of square kilometers of ocean while maintaining near-total electronic stealth. The ability to see enemy forces clearly while remaining functionally invisible to their sensors. The ability to strike with precision from beyond visual range, then disappear back into electronic silence before countermeasures could be employed. Soviet naval strategy in any potential World War III scenario depended on certain assumptions. They assumed their submarines could track American carrier groups by following their electromagnetic signatures. They assumed their reconnaissance aircraft could locate American fleets from their radar emissions. They assumed that in any engagement, Both sides would be visible to each other electronically, and victory would go to whoever had better missiles, better countermeasures, and better tactics. Operation Praying Mantis suggested those assumptions were catastrophically wrong. If the Americans could make their warships effectively invisible to electronic surveillance while simultaneously tracking and destroying enemy forces, then the entire Soviet naval strategy was obsolete. The massive investment in cruise missile submarines, in long-range bombers carrying anti-ship weapons, in a huge surface fleet designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers, all of it presumed the Soviets would be able to find and target American ships. What if they couldn't? The reports from the Persian Gulf filtered up through Soviet military intelligence channels. Senior officers read them with mounting alarm. Some were skeptical. Perhaps the Iranians simply had inadequate equipment, poorly trained operators. But the Iranian Navy had been using American and British equipment, some of it quite modern. Their personnel had received Western training during the Shah's era. They weren't incompetent. And the Soviet observers had been using top-tier surveillance equipment operated by their most experienced technicians. If they'd missed most of the electronic activity from the American fleet, it wasn't because their equipment was faulty, it was because the Americans had found a way to hide. Throughout the late 1980s, Soviet military leadership had been grappling with disturbing intelligence from multiple sources. Reports from their agents in the West spoke of revolutionary developments in computer technology, in signal processing, in radar design. The Americans were pouring resources into something they called stealth technology, aircraft designed to be nearly invisible to radar. Soviet scientists had initially dismissed this as propaganda. Surely you couldn't make something as large as an aircraft invisible to radar. But then their early warning systems started failing to detect certain American aircraft during exercises near Soviet airspace. And now, in the Persian Gulf, American warships had demonstrated similar capabilities in the electronic domain. The implications cascaded through every level of Soviet military planning. If American aircraft could penetrate Soviet air defenses undetected, their plans for defending against NATO bombers were compromised. If American ships could operate undetected in contested waters, their plans for interdicting NATO supply lines across the Atlantic were compromised. If American forces could see Soviet units while remaining invisible themselves, the numerical advantage Soviet doctrine depended on became meaningless. You can't shoot what you can't find. The Soviet Union's military-industrial complex was already straining under economic pressure. The war in Afghanistan was bleeding resources and morale. The civilian economy was stagnating, and now their military leadership was being forced to confront the possibility that their most expensive weapon systems, their aircraft, their ships, their entire strategic doctrine, had been rendered obsolete by American technological advances they couldn't match. Soviet engineers and scientists were brilliant, but they were working within a system that couldn't match American investment in computer technology, microelectronics, and the advanced materials necessary for electronic warfare systems. The centrally planned economy that had once allowed the Soviet Union to focus resources on specific military priorities was now a handicap. The Americans were leveraging their entire tech sector, commercial computing, semiconductor manufacturing, telecommunications, and applying those advances to military systems. The Soviet Union couldn't compete on those terms. The reports from Operation Praying Mantis became part of a larger mosaic of intelligence that painted a grim picture. The Americans weren't just ahead in one or two areas. They were opening up a technological gap across multiple domains: stealth, precision guidance, electronic warfare, communications, battlefield computers, and that gap was widening. Senior Soviet military officials began presenting these assessments to political leadership. The message was stark. In any conventional conflict with NATO, Soviet forces couldn't count on their traditional advantages. They couldn't count on finding enemy forces. They couldn't count on their weapons reaching their targets. They couldn't count on their defensive systems stopping enemy attacks. The Cold War military competition, which had for decades been measured in numbers of tanks, numbers of aircraft, numbers of missiles, had shifted to a new dimension where quality trumped quantity in ways Soviet industry couldn't match. For some in the Soviet leadership, Operation Praying Mantis marked a turning point in their thinking. If they couldn't compete militarily with the West, if the technological gap was only going to widen, then what was the point of bankrupting the country trying? The reformers arguing for reduced military spending and improved relations with the West gained ammunition. The hardliners who insisted the Soviet Union could prevail in any confrontation found their arguments undermined by their own intelligence reports. One 8-hour naval engagement in a peripheral theatre of the Cold War shouldn't have changed anything. It was just one battle against a third-rate regional power over some oil platforms and patrol boats. But for the Soviet officers who watched it unfold, or rather tried to watch it unfold through their suddenly inadequate surveillance systems, it revealed something terrifying about the future of warfare. The Americans hadn't just won a battle. They'd demonstrated capabilities that rendered Soviet military strategy obsolete. They'd shown they could fight and win, while their opponents remained blind. They'd proven that decades of Soviet investment in naval forces, in surveillance systems, in electronic warfare capabilities had been overtaken by American advances. Within 3 years of Operation Praying Mantis, the Soviet Union would begin its final collapse. Many factors contributed: economic stagnation, political reform, nationalist movements, the burden of empire. But among military leaders and strategic planners, there was a quiet recognition that they'd already lost the competition that mattered most. They couldn't match American military technology. They couldn't protect Soviet forces from American weapons. They couldn't find American forces to attack them. The Cold War wasn't going to end with nuclear Armageddon or tank battles across the German plains. It was going to end because one side had developed such overwhelming technological superiority that continued competition was pointless. For 8 hours in the Persian Gulf, Soviet intelligence officers had watched the future of warfare unfold. They'd watched their radars fail to track enemy forces. They'd watched their surveillance systems provide only fragments of information. They'd watched a modern navy get systematically destroyed while the attackers remained virtually invisible. They'd watched from their disguised vessels as the Cold War ended. They just didn't know it yet. The electromagnetic spectrum, invisible to human eyes, had become the decisive battle space. And in that battle space, the Americans had achieved dominance so complete that Soviet observers with front-row seats to the battle could barely see what was happening. That was the real terror of Operation Praying Mantis. Not the firepower, not the precision, but the blindness. The sudden understanding that in the most important dimension of modern warfare, the Soviet Union was already defeated. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.